The Siege of Paris in 885 to 886 is remembered not because it was the biggest battle of the age, but because it shows how geography, fortifications, and politics could stop even a highly mobile Viking force. Paris was still a compact city focused on the Île de la Cité, and its greatest strength was the river itself. The Seine was the main route into the interior of West Francia. If an attacking fleet could pass Paris, it could threaten settlements and monasteries far upstream. If Paris held, it could block that entire river corridor. The bridge system was central to this. Low crossings connected the island to both banks, and fortified towers guarded the bridgeheads. That meant the river was not an open highway at Paris. It was a controlled gate. For the Vikings, who relied on shallow draft longships and quick river movement, these bridges created a problem that speed could not solve. To continue upriver, they needed either a negotiated passage, a large payment that made the expedition worthwhile without further risk, or a way to break the bridge defenses. By late November 885, a large Viking force arrived on the Seine and anchored near Paris. They landed men, equipment, and supplies and began establishing a camp. This was a key sign of intent, not a fast raid, but a sustained operation. The first stage was negotiation. Viking leaders approached with demands that were common in the period: tribute or permission to pass upriver. The logic was straightforward. If Paris allowed passage, the Vikings could avoid the hardest fighting and still gain access to rich targets upstream. Paris, however, could not accept that without effectively surrendering the Seine corridor. Count Odo led the defense and rejected the demand. This decision mattered more than any single skirmish. Once refusal was clear, the situation became a siege. The Vikings prepared for direct assault, and the defenders prepared for endurance. Both sides understood that the bridges and their towers were the key. From that point forward, much of the fighting focused on the bridge towers, the gates, and the narrow approaches where attackers had to advance under fire. The first assaults tested the defenses in a practical way. Vikings advanced in groups protected by shields, using ladders to reach walls and attempting to force entry at weak points. Frankish defenders answered with missiles from above, arrows, stones, and whatever could be thrown accurately and repeatedly. The defenders also used close-range methods to break assaults at the moment they became most dangerous, when attackers reached the base of walls or the gate itself. This early phase established the pattern of the siege. The Vikings could apply strong pressure, but the fortifications and the constrained approaches reduced the advantage of numbers. When initial attacks failed to create a decisive breach, the Vikings shifted into a longer plan. They expanded their camp and treated the siege as an operation that required logistics, engineering, and time. A siege is as much about supply as combat. The Vikings needed food and materials. The city needed to conserve and ration. Outside the walls, the surrounding countryside became part of the battlefield. The attackers took livestock and food where they could, and disrupted local movement to prevent Paris from easily resupplying. Inside the city, civilians and defenders adapted to scarcity. Food stores were measured carefully. Repairs became constant work. Watches had to be organized so men did not collapse from exhaustion. Through the winter of 885 to 886, the siege settled into cycles. There were periods of active fighting and periods of tension and preparation. Skirmishes and arrow exchanges continued. The Vikings built protective screens and improved their positions to reduce the effectiveness of the defenders' arrows. They dug works and tried to create safer approaches to the bridgehead. Each improvement increased the pressure on the towers by reducing the cost of getting close. The defenders watched these efforts carefully because even small advantages could accumulate over months. Paris, meanwhile, relied on the discipline of its defense. bridge towers had to be held continuously. If a tower fell, the attackers could gain a foothold that might allow them to expand into the crossing itself. For the defenders, the walls did not end the danger. They concentrated it. Every day demanded readiness, repairs, and the ability to respond to sudden assaults. The psychological burden was heavy. The city could not relax, and it could not easily break the siege. In early 886, the Vikings attempted a more dramatic tactic, aimed at damaging the bridge system itself: fire. Burning ships or fire-laden vessels were pushed into the river with the hope that flames would reach the wooden parts of the bridge defenses. Fire could weaken supports, create panic, and potentially open a gap. In practice, river conditions and the complexity of directing burning craft meant the result was limited. The attempt did not instantly decide the siege, but it contributed to stress on the structures, and it demonstrated how much the Vikings understood that the true target was not simply a wall, but the river barrier. Then a different force became decisive: weather. On February 6, 886, heavy rains raised the level of the Seine and turned the river into a destructive tool. Floodwater put pressure on bridge supports that were already strained. Parts of the bridge system failed. A section collapsed, and one bridge tower became isolated by water, cut off from the main defensive line. This created an opportunity for the attackers, because an isolated position cannot be reinforced or relieved easily. In a siege, isolation is often fatal. The Vikings concentrated on the isolated tower. Later retellings emphasized the small number of defenders, 12 men, who held it and refused to surrender. Whether every detail is exact or shaped by the narrative tradition, the tactical meaning is clear. The attackers gained a localized success when the defenders' position was separated from the rest of the fortifications. The assault involved ladders, close combat, and the brutal logic of a tower that could no longer be supported. The garrison was killed when the tower was taken. This was a hard moment for Paris, because it proved that a single structural failure could undo months of resistance in one section. Yet even after this loss, Paris did not fall. The main defenses on the Île de la Cité continued to hold. The fall of an isolated tower weakened the bridge system and gave the Vikings a victory they could display, but it still did not grant full control of the city or a clean passage upriver. The siege returned to its longer form: pressure, repeated attacks, and the slow attempt to exhaust the defenders. As winter turned to spring and then summer, both sides suffered from the same basic problems: fatigue, supply strain, and the cumulative damage of months under harsh conditions. The Vikings had to feed and manage a large force far from home while maintaining cohesion. The defenders had to ration, treat the wounded, and maintain fortifications under constant threat. In this stage, leadership and organization became as important as weapons. The defenders needed routines: repairing walls, rotating watch, conserving arrows, controlling morale. The attackers needed routines too: maintaining camp discipline, preventing sickness, and keeping enough pressure on the city to make the siege worthwhile. Count Odo's role remained central. He was not simply a symbolic figure. The defense required decisions about where to place men, how to allocate resources, and how to respond to Viking adaptations. A major strategic problem for Paris was the lack of immediate relief. A city can hold walls for a long time, but without help, starvation and disease can defeat it as surely as an assault. The longer the siege lasted, the more the outcome depended on whether the wider political system of West Francia would respond effectively. One dramatic solution attributed to Odo in many summaries is a breakout, leaving the city with a small group to seek assistance directly. Such a move was dangerous because the defenders could lose their leader, and the siege lines could catch and destroy a small party outside the walls. But it also made sense. If relief was not coming, someone had to push the issue and force a response. The idea was to turn the city's endurance into a political obligation for the king or emperor. By autumn 886, imperial forces finally arrived. Emperor Charles the Fat came with an army, and for many defenders, this should have been the moment of decisive battle. With a field army outside and the city still resisting, the Vikings could, in theory, be trapped or forced into a costly fight. A major engagement might have ended the siege with a clear victory and restored confidence in central. That is not what happened. Charles chose negotiation rather than a full battle. The settlement that ended the siege is widely described as involving a substantial payment in silver, often given as 700 pounds of silver. This was, in effect, a political purchase of peace at Paris. Rather than destroying the Viking force, the empire paid it to depart, and in some retellings, allowed it to move on toward other regions, such as Burgundy. The key result for Paris was immediate survival. The siege ended, and the city was not stormed. But the political cost was significant. For the defenders who had endured months of danger, the ending could feel like anticlimax or even betrayal. They had held the walls and absorbed the suffering, yet the final act was a transaction. This outcome affected reputations. Charles's choice was seen as cautious and practical by some, but it could also be interpreted as weakness because it avoided a decisive confrontation. Odo, by contrast, gained prestige because his leadership was linked to the city's resistance and survival in the face of prolonged pressure. When the Vikings departed, the visible signs of siege remained. Bridges needed repair. Walls showed patched damage. The countryside around the river carried the scars of raids and foraging. Inside the city, normal life returned slowly. Markets reopened, supplies remained thin, and the population carried the memory of months of uncertainty. Rebuilding was not just a matter of comfort, it was a defensive necessity. Restoring the bridge system and strengthening the towers mattered because future raids could repeat the same strategy if Paris remained the key river gate. The siege's longer-term importance lies in what it revealed about power in West Francia. Central authority was not always quick or decisive, and regional leaders who could organize defense gained influence. The reputation Odo earned during the siege later contributed to his rise in West Frankish politics. In broader terms, the episode illustrates a transition in how protection was provided. Local fortifications and local leadership could matter as much as royal armies, especially when raids were fast and frequent. The siege is also shaped by the sources that describe it. A major narrative account comes from Abbo of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and later retellings often preserve the elements that make the story memorable. The bridge towers, the long endurance, the winter flood, the isolated tower, the arrival of Charles, and the negotiated settlement. Because medieval sources differ in emphasis, modern summaries often focus on the strategic logic rather than claiming certainty for every dramatic detail. Still, the core storyline remains consistent. A Viking force tried to break the Seine gate. Paris resisted behind bridge towers. Nature damaged the defenses, and politics ended the siege through payment rather than decisive battle. Seen from a distance, the Siege of Paris, 885 to 886, is a lesson in early medieval warfare. Geography can decide strategy. Fortifications can neutralize mobility. Weather can change outcomes more suddenly than any commander. And politics can override what soldiers expect on the battlefield. Paris survived because it was built in the right place, defended with endurance, and ultimately spared by a decision made at a higher level. For the history of France and for the memory of the Viking Age in the West, that combination is exactly what makes the siege a defining episode.